6 p.m. on the dot, Senator Raphael Warnock went live on Instagram, Facebook, Blue Sky, and X.
Well, hello, Georgia. Thank you so very much for joining my town hall. It's so wonderful just to be able to speak with all of you tonight virtually.
For roughly 35 minutes, the Georgia Democrat fielded voter questions selected by staff.
Darlene from Hall County asks, I'm 82 years old. Am I in danger of losing my Social Security? Val from Flower Branch, Georgia asks, I'm a veteran. I work at the VA, and we are already short-staffed.
Some voters sought reassurance. Others pressed for a plan.
Knox from Barrow County, Georgia asked this question live. How do we get the Doge in check and stop doing damage across our government?
Warnock sharply criticized the new administration, including billionaire Elon Musk.
When I look at the billionaires who are pushing forward their agenda right now in Washington, D.C., forgive me, but in the words of Kendrick Lamar, they're not like us.
But in the comment section, many voters were not satisfied with what they were hearing. This is weak, one person wrote. No action plan, wrote another.
Coming up, how Democrats are grappling with the rapid changes coming from Washington.
We also spend time with a member of Trump's cabinet visiting the state capitol.
The first thing I want to say is what a joy it is to be here in Georgia with all of you. We are doing a full day. We're meeting with some farmers. We're touring some facilities.
And check on the governor's top legislative priority, which is hitting some speed bumps. I'm WABE politics reporter Rahul Bali.
I'm WABE politics reporter Sam Gringlas, and this is Plugged In from WABE.
So, Sam, this event was billed as a virtual town hall. What was the setup?
So this venue was not your typical community center or union hall. It was exclusively online. You know, many lawmakers who have hosted in-person town halls recently have faced angry crowds asking pointed questions, most notably Republican Congressman Rich McCormick in Roswell. That is not what happened here because Warnock staffers selected and relayed all the questions. And that's in contrast to a town hall I attended with Warnock around this time of year in 2022 when people packed this big government building in downtown Decatur and stood up to ask their questions on mic.
So, Sam, what were people asking about?
Well, Warnock took 10 of them. He asked about job cuts at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in the Atlanta VA and potential cuts to Medicaid and the power of billionaire Elon Musk. Most questions seemed to come from critics of President Trump, but a couple did appear to come from Republicans. One man wrote in asking why the U.S. spends so much on foreign aid. Another asked about balancing the budget.
So what did Senator Warnock have to say?
Rahul, it was interesting. Unsurprisingly, Warnock condemned Trump's moves to slash federal programs and funding. I noticed he mirrored other Democrats who have been increasingly training criticism on Elon Musk. And he said he was keeping federal employees in his prayers and pledged to fight for them. While many voters were asking for reassurance about their Social Security benefits or Medicaid or health care at the VA, others were hungry for a plan of action. Warnock says senators are engaging in oversight by questioning officials in committee and pressing their case in the public square by making noise, saying that helped some fired CDC employees get their jobs back. He also says he's been personally lobbying VA Secretary Doug Collins, who's a former Georgia congressman.
As I make the argument for you on the floor of the United States Senate, as I push my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, because we're seeing a lot of damage from this in blue states and red states on both sides of the aisle. I need to hear your stories.
But Warnock also noted the reality of serving in the minority, especially when the administration is not looking like it's going to bend to any oversight. Still, it's not clear that Warnock's answers were satisfying to people. In the comment sections, voters posted hundreds more questions and criticism. One person wrote, "We've heard all the talking points. What we want to hear is if measures are being taken." Another wrote, "We see what's happening. What are the actual next steps?" Warnock mentioned he was in Selma last weekend for the 60th anniversary of Bloody Sunday and urged voters not to give up the fight.
They are literally trying to weaponize despair, to so overwhelm you that you start to think that we've already lost and you might as well give up. That is the dream of wannabe autocrats. That is the dream of the oligarchs. That is the dream of folks who want to reshape this country into something we do not recognize.
But Rahul, the comments kept on coming until the live stream ended.
You know, Sam, we always talk about avoid reading the comment section of anything on social media, but this really seemed like that's where a lot of the reaction was. So, Sam, let's hear from a member of the Trump administration. This week, I was at the state capitol for a visit by Agriculture Secretary Brooke Rollins.
Yeah, she'd been serving as the Agriculture Secretary in Florida, our neighbor to the south, when she was appointed by Trump.
And, Sam, she was actually sworn in exactly a month ago.
So, Rahul, this week, Trump's trade war with Canada, Mexico, and China has been escalating, sending the stock market plummeting. Tariffs could also affect Georgia farmers. What did Secretary Rollins have to say about that?
So, Sam, let's start with the fact that lawmakers here at the Capitol are fond of reminding reporters that agriculture is the state's leading industry. The folks at the UGA Center for Agribusiness and Economic Development put that number at over $80 billion contributed to the state's economy. And then looking at the numbers, the state's number one agricultural commodity by value are broilers.
What are broilers? I feel like this should be a question at our next Politics and Pints trivia night.
Well, Sam, broilers are those chickens raised for meat production. I got some federal data from the folks at the Georgia Department of Agriculture that shows Georgia exported $1.5 billion of agricultural goods just to Canada, China, and Mexico. And one of the top products? Poultry products. And that brings us to your question, Sam, of what happens if there are negative consequences for Georgia agriculture. For example, China's brand new 15% tax on American farm goods like chickens. Secretary Rollins brought up the tariffs during the first Trump administration.
Obviously, there was some consequences for our agriculture community in that first term, and the USDA, with the great Sonny Perdue, stepped up and worked to make those consequences whole. I would suspect if the same result occurs this time around, that there will be the same relief there. We're working on preparing for that.
Now, Rollins there referring to former Georgia Governor Sonny Perdue, who served as Agriculture Secretary during Trump's first term.
The Trump administration has been moving to slash the size of the federal government, in part by cutting programs across agencies and departments, and I imagine that includes the USDA.
That's right, Sam. You know, one of the things the secretary was asked about was the cutting of a pair of programs that allow schools and food banks to buy from local farms. Here's what she had to say about that.
On that particular program, that was a new COVID-era program. It was specific to COVID only. It had already been, multiples of grants had already been moved out under that program. So what we pulled back was money that had not been spent yet and had not been committed yet.
Yeah, Rahul, this was a program that Georgia Democratic Senator Jon Ossoff really championed, and it included a lot of Georgia farmers. In a statement this week, Ossoff condemned the cancellation of this program, saying it will hurt Georgia kids and Georgia farmers, and he urged the Trump administration to reverse course.
You know, Sam, it's interesting. Rollins seemed to try to broadly head off some of those criticisms.
This president was elected on November 5th with every single swing state in the popular vote. That was a mandate, and every single category of voter moved toward the freedom, free market, America First agenda on that election day. And the president, and alongside his cabinet, believe very sincerely that that mandate includes a government, a federal government that is leaner, that is more efficient, that serves the people better, and that returns power to the people.
You know, over the last few months, our newsroom has been chronicling the effects of Hurricane Helene and the long recovery after that storm. And one of the things I remember hearing about in the aftermath was, you know, these acres and acres of pecan trees damaged, chicken houses totally wiped out, timber forests destroyed. What did the secretary have to say about the recovery efforts now?
Sam, she seemed to have some good news for Georgians who are waiting for help.
Those funds, I think you're talking about the ones that Congress passed at the end of last year around Christmas time, the disaster and emergency relief, both for Helene but also for our farmers that are hurting. That money will begin to move in the next few weeks. We were given a deadline by Congress, which isn't often met, but for me it was very important we meet it, of March 21st. We will actually beat that deadline. So you'll be hearing more about that in the coming days.
You know, Sam, to put a fine point on this segment, very much like the Biden administration, I think we're going to continue to see Trump administration officials making their way back to Georgia to talk up administration policies. And of course, two of those key officials are from Georgia, VA Secretary Doug Collins and SBA Administrator Kelly Loeffler.
Let's take a break here. You're listening to Plugged In from WABE. Welcome back to Plugged In from WABE. We've been talking about how what's happening in Washington is trickling down to Georgia. Rahul, you've been looking at an interesting example of this.
So, Sam, we're talking about Senate Bill 154, which deals with what happens with Georgia's laws if the U.S. Department of Education goes away. Here's the bill's author, Republican State Senator Bo Hatchett, noting that the U.S. Department of Education is referenced in Georgia's legal code 25 times.
Of most importance, it deals with licensing professionals. And so in order to become a licensed professional in the state of Georgia, you have to graduate or complete a certain school that is recognized by the U.S. Department of Education. If that goes away, technically, peace officers, social workers, dentists, dental hygienists, dental assistants, massage therapists, optometrists, psychologists, speech-language pathologists, and audiologists, the list goes on, they would not be able to be accredited or be licensed in the state of Georgia.
So, Sam, what Senate Bill 154 does is it inserts the words or its successor wherever it says U.S. Department of Education or United States Department of Education. Before this passed the Senate, Democrats there raised their frustrations about the Trump administration moving toward shutting down the agency. Now, I want to skip forward to this week when a House Education Subcommittee took up Senate Bill 154. Here's an interesting exchange between Hatchett and Democratic State Representative David Wilkerson.
I would be shocked if one side of the aisle decided to abolish the Department of Education, and they need that in the Senate, as we know how it works there. So is this just encouraging the behavior that we see coming from D.C. to say, look, states are already passing things to anticipate this, so why don't we do away with it? What's the stop?
I mean, I don't know of any other state that has done this yet.
So every other state's going to be out of work except for Georgia?
I honestly haven't looked at other states' laws. What I'm doing is just trying to make sure. I mean, I looked at our laws and the way they're written, we would not technically be able to license a nurse moving forward if we don't make this change. And so, you know, what happens in D.C., I like you said, I can't read their mind, but at least we know, and it looks like it's going in this direction, and we're going to be ready. And if nothing happens, we're still going to be ready.
I do want to mention that Hatchett accepted an amendment to his bill that would make the legislation take effect if Congress actually disbands the Department of Education, not just the Trump administration moving on their own to gut the department.
Okay, so you're talking about the possibility of the Trump administration closing up shop at the U.S. Department of Education. This would also have implications for the state budget, which relies on billions of dollars in funding from the feds, not just for education, but for a whole host of areas.
That's right, Sam. The biggest chunk of that federal money is for healthcare programs like Medicaid, but there's also significant dollars for higher education and K-12 education. Democratic House Minority Leader Carolyn Hughley is one of the folks raising the alarm.
What keeps me up at night is wondering what would happen if they make good on their promise to dissolve the Department of Education. What type of responsibilities will then come down to the state, and if there are going to be any monies to go along with that. Changes in Medicaid and Medicare, all of those will have a significant impact on our budget here. We've been conservative in Georgia, but the surplus won't take care of all of that. So we have to keep our eye on what's happening at the federal level.
During a signing ceremony for the 2025 amended state budget last week, I asked Governor Kemp about concerns over the state budget because of cuts from the Trump administration and the Republican-led Congress.
Well, I will tell you that the members of the General Assembly standing behind me were dealing with those kind of cuts from the Biden administration. You know, when you think about a lot of these nonprofits that were getting money during COVID, and then the federal government quit funding those things, and everybody looks to the state to pick up the slack. I don't want to speak for the members, but my personal perspective is the federal government needs to be right-sized. We cannot continue as Americans to spend the amount of money that we're doing and not have, fiscal discipline in Washington, D.C.
That brings me around to a conversation I had with Republican State Representative Matt Hatchett, who is the chairman of the House Appropriations Committee.
It's on all of our minds. We can't work on a budget from the possibilities that something may happen. So, if something really drastic occurs that, we can always come back and fine-tune the budget. None of us really want to, but it's been done before.
Hatchett there referring to the possibility of a special session, which I know brings joy to your ears, Sam, especially because separately, Governor Kemp has threatened a special session if his legislative priority of overhauling civil litigation rules is not passed this year. So, Sam, we will have 2 special sessions.
Absolutely not. Okay, so let's talk about that push to overhaul civil litigation rules. Backers of the effort are still working to secure enough support in the House ahead of a possible vote next week.
So, Sam, the bill has already passed the Senate, but faces a more difficult path in the House. Remind us what's in the legislation.
Broadly, SB 68 is designed to curb big payouts in civil lawsuits like personal injury cases. The bill makes several sweeping changes, some of the most hotly debated ones, allowing jurors to know whether an accident victim was wearing a seatbelt, splitting trials into 2 parts, so juries have to establish liability before even considering damages, showing juries a breakdown of costs when considering medical damages, so what did the provider charge, what did the insurance company actually pay after negotiation, and what did the patient pay themselves, and narrowing the grounds for when property owners can be held liable for harm on their premises.
Sam, this week a special House committee heard hours and hours of public testimony on the 18-page bill. Can we dig into maybe one provision and help our listeners get a sense of some of the sticking points?
Yeah, one of the things this bill does is narrows when a property owner can be held liable for harm caused by foreseeable criminal activity around the premises. This is known as negligent security, and it's a section a lot of business leaders are really focused on, including John Verveer, who you may know as the chair of the Georgia State Election Board, but his day job is actually quite relevant to this debate. He is the vice president of risk management at Waffle House, and he actually testified wearing his Waffle House uniform.
20% of our restaurants are in Georgia. 83% of our legal costs are in Georgia. Georgia costs 10 times more than Texas, 21 times more than South Carolina, 27 times more than Alabama, and 89 times more than North Carolina.
Verveer and other business leaders are amping up their push to get this bill across the finish line. As we mentioned, it's not a done deal, and supporters have yet to lock in enough votes to get it passed. Underscoring that was this big press conference of business leaders held Thursday on the north steps of the Capitol. This is Haley Bauer-Frank with Clipper Petroleum. They operate about 24 convenience stores in North Georgia and have battled what they say are many frivolous and expensive lawsuits.
We are having to make tough decisions to close during inclement weather, like snow and ice, for fear of slip and fall, even after adequately de-icing sidewalks. There are times when we have to decide, is it worth the risk? Do we serve the public or protect our company during weather events?
But the opposition has been mobilizing this week as well, and some of the most emotional testimony came from sexual assault survivors. One woman, introduced as KH when she testified in committee, said her apartment complex failed to protect residents from a man who repeatedly committed sexual assault and armed robbery on the property.
Survivors and victims deserve justice. We deserve to be heard. Because here I am again, me versus my residents, me versus my rapist, and now me versus the state of Georgia.
And in their own show of force, opponents of the legislation also gathered across the Capitol Rotunda at the South Steps just a few hours after the business leaders. Multiple survivors of human trafficking and sexual assault, as well as family members and attorneys, urged lawmakers to vote against the overhaul. Michael Roseberry says she was trafficked at a hotel.
If you pass this bill as it is, you are telling every single trafficker, every single hotel manager who ignored the bruises, every maid who emptied out those trash cans full of condoms, and every business owner who profited from our captivity that their silence is acceptable.
The survivors have focused on this provision on premises liability and negligent security, but also the part about requiring trials to be split into multiple parts, which could result in them having to testify about their experience multiple times.
Hey, Sam, anything else interesting stand out to you as you watch these hours of hearings this week?
Rahul, so many of the bills we cover are either DOA or certain to pass, depending on whether they have the backing of GOP leadership and Governor Kemp. But this debate still feels very active, given especially the public advocacy efforts that have been ramping up this week. And I want you to take notice of something we just heard from that last survivor. If you pass the bill as it is. So I'm looking for what changes might happen before this gets to the floor. Remember, a handful of potential GOP holdouts won a concession before SB 68 passed the Senate. We did hear one of the business leaders say at this press conference that we want to pass this bill clean, i.e. as is. So a key question is, how much are Kemp and his allies willing to negotiate? Survivors may also have an outsized political voice in this debate. Civil litigation overhaul may be a top priority of Governor Kemp, but you know what's among the top priorities of First Lady Marty Kemp? Combating human trafficking. This provision is one of several sticking points that could hold up the bill, and we know Democrats are preparing to oppose it, so supporters can't afford to lose too many Republicans. Though they say they are confident that between changes, incentives, and pressure, they can secure enough votes by the time the legislation gets to the House floor, possibly next week. And of course, whatever happens could have big implications for so many Georgians.
So that's it for this edition of Plugged In from WABE. Plugged In is produced by Brendan Rivers. Our managing editor is Alex Helmick.
Plugged In is available wherever you want to listen. If you listen on demand, make sure to head on over to the Plugged In feed to subscribe, leave us a rating, and a review. You can now also find us on the radio at 90.1 every Friday morning from 9:30 to 10 a.m.
Have a great weekend.